Yes, so we're at the top of the hour, so I think Francois and Alex, whenever you're ready to start, I think we can go ahead and proceed with the second part of the session.
Sure. Let's just wait for Francois.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
So that would, I mean, it's now an open discussion before we start on the recommendation, maybe later.
Okay, yeah. Sorry, I didn't want to barge into those recommendations. Yeah, we have plenty of time, so you're right.
So what could be interesting is to have the position of the floor from the floor about the different indicators, whether they think they are relevant, they are not, and what could be supported and where we have to focus on and so. Shall we discuss new indicators maybe, or modeling, or?
So at least from my perspective, it seems like the marine biota stood out as something that is currently out of the framework, and then we've heard different ideas right this morning and already this afternoon about the mussels and your proposal for the turtles.
The point is that if we just keep on state and pressure indicators, such as amounts, for instance, of floating, and then we don't have any information about the harm. And so it doesn't mean it's impacting, you see. Beach litter, for instance, is largely aesthetic impact, when it's far less in terms of harm than, floating litter and entanglement, ingestion, and so on. So it's complicated to manage just only pressure or state indicators. And we have to consider somewhere, at least in the future, maybe not, in the coming years, but later then, harm indicators is quite important because we don't have actually indicator for ecosystem response. And even harm ingested litter is not probably the best one because it's not just only harm, but it could be just also amount ingested without effect in many cases. And but we cannot go for global monitoring without indication information on harm, and this is quite important. So
the two ideas that I heard, they probably address very different aspects or classes of marine litter, right? Because for the turtles, you're talking about entanglement with microplastics.
No. Entanglement is a complex task because you cannot distinguish most of the time between active fishing gear that have been taken from the fishing gear, and animals taking them directly from the gear and traveling with them from those that are really litter. And so the interpretation is really difficult. I understand that some old nets can be recorded as entangling when more recent is probably more active, but it's not clear. And so in terms of indication for monitoring is not so well adapted. So there may be some different approaches. Very recently, using imagery, for instance, or by diving, it's quite easy to record interaction between organism and litter in nets, for instance, LDFG and so on, and ILDFG. And so it could be an opportunity that may build on the existing indicator on seafloor, especially from imagery. But that's the next step in terms of entanglement. And entanglement, in fact, is very important because this is the most impacting litter in terms of mortality and so on. A fishing gear that has been lost on the seafloor is fishing for at least months and maybe more than 1 year This is the data we have. So it means that you cannot see it, but it may affect 2-3% of a fish population in some areas only. So it's a big loss in terms of, not only in terms of environment, but also in terms of economy for fishing, for fishermen. So it's really impacting, but there is no way to monitor it properly. So interaction is a possibility. There is a lot of research on that. More and more paper coming, but it will take years before it's considering. I'm not sure that we may rely on it for global monitoring now. So I myself, I do have a question to René. It's about best practices. It's not clear to me exactly what best practices mean. And I know there will be a dedicated session. And for monitor, for instance, I understand that we may have guidelines for the right way of sampling and so on. This is what I understood. But there is still some mystery around the world. And maybe you can help us in order to better define, exactly what we need for monitor indicators in terms of best practices.
So I just took a look of the ocean best practice website repository now, and I try to find the best practice, proposed best practice related to the marine debris, marine litter, the plastics, and I found it 326 best plastics on the marine debris on the repository. So I think that many of them are proposing the methodology, but that is the journal paper. So there are so many different kind of best practice already on the on the website, their website. So I just wonder how can we give them the recommendation about to promote the the global marine litter monitoring, and also the harmonization and developing the indicator to the to the best ocean best practice. We may need a best practice for the best practice, maybe. I don't know how to. I don't know how to explain this one, but
So
there are already so many best practice.
yeah, I mean, there's a couple of issues that I could comment here on. There's one thing is to get some information into the OBPS repository, and that is useful for promoting the availability of guidelines and best practices and recommendations out there in the community. Finding these documents for such a repository might be more easily or universally accessible than say looking for these documents on websites of expert working groups or institutions. So I think that's a good service. But it's true that there's different levels of best practices, and I think for the sake of the discussions we're having this week, I think we have to distinguish between sort of the more mature elements of the system, which I would consider, for example, this session. I think there's a lot of guidelines and best practices already available, and thanks to the work of GESAMP, looks like they already have achieved some level of harmonization and standardization, or at least you have recommendations on how to do that, right? So the next step would be to try and to move into something like standard protocols that could be universally accepted for the benefit of globally upscaling the monitoring and making sure that the data is collected and streamed in a way that is findable, comparable, reusable, and so on. But for other elements like remote sensing or modeling, I think the discussions are on the level of exactly, yeah, what are the elements of these activities that we need best practices for, and what would that entail? So this is just different levels of conversations. And I really like that slide. I think it was slide 30, Francois, on the different processes in the whole cycle. And then I think this is where my question also earlier on alluded to, that for which indicators or for which parameters that you need to monitor would you need to focus your efforts to establish best practices, let's say for a quality assurance step, or maybe we need best practices already on the level of collection of data. For some other things, maybe the quality assurance is already there, but there's no standardized or there are no best practices in how to stream the data correctly. Maybe this is the case for citizen science, for example. But my sort of take on this session would be to focus on the ones that are relatively advanced and high on the readiness level list, and see how we can bring them a notch further from best practices to something that could really be standard for the global community.
I do have one comment, please. I think there are two different processes. One is general, so we just recommend how to do, our best, I will say. And the other are more dedicated to a dedicated indicator for a dedicated objective. So in the case of global monitoring, once we have shortlisted each of the indicators of interest, then we need dedicated best practices for each of the indicators. And it will not be something like recommending to have the best, harmonizing and so on, but to go really in detail to know exactly, listing all the different steps, and then providing details on what we have to do and how we have to do, so that any party, country, institution, and so on will be able to do the same. And so it's not a general statement, it must be really precise. But it may be complex because there was one paper from a French team very recently about quality assurance for the assessment of microplastics in mussels. And they found that more than 120 different sources of error for doing the analysis, just extraction procedures, analysis, and so on. So when you want to have something very good in terms of analysis and so on, and then for monitoring, it could be very, very complex. So the level of details you need will probably have to be decided before we could start on that. At the end, that will be probably a dedicated document. This is what it was one of my recommendations, to have something like for beach litter, we need to sample that way, this place, and so on. Taking advantage of the protocols already in place, but also some new insights that will have to be considered.
Arthur, this point raised by Francois is important, and we can transpose it to beach management, which seems something calm, easy to do, but it's not really, because it takes time. It takes people to sample and to separate the litter. So it's not trivial for all countries to do that. And perhaps we may consider that if we reduce the level of the tail, I'm not suggesting that, but I'm just making a rationale. If we reduce the level of the tail in the analysis of data and use images instead of counting of pieces in the beach, we may have less information, but we may have more information globally and through time, so that the degrees of freedom perhaps increase the power of the monitoring of trends. So this is an important aspect. What we would like to know, would we like to know trends, and then we can follow up trends using harmonized but not standardized protocols, because we may see trends like this. These are not the same data, but they are showing the same trends. Or are we interested in comparing areas and identify hotspots to invest money, for example, to solve the problem? These are very different. These are quite different questions that will guide what we are going to do in terms of monitoring and data gathering. So I would like to share these soft thoughts and perhaps to see it captured in the.
I think we have a question, no?
Sorry, Francois?
We have a question from Dr. Venkatesan, no? Hand raised.
At this point, what he raised only, I would like to say, we talk about pollutants, we talk about heavy metals, we identify hotspots and work on it. Are we planning to have suggesting to have the same approach? Because plastic is slightly different. He rightly said, the previous speaker, yes, of course, near the beach, it's more linked to tourism and the visibility, the larger plastic play a major role. You get into open ocean, the perspective is totally different. We talk about microplastic and the relation to that. Then on to the sediment, it's again a totally different phenomena. So are you identifying a procedure by which we keep collecting the small particles? So how are we going to finally use this data for interpretation? Are you going to identify this place has got this much number of quantity of microplastics particles? We declare that as a most pollutant place. So I wish clarity comes through this discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that there are 2 points. The consideration of contaminants is part of chemical assessment, not really plastic, unless it's a component of plastics, such as additives and so on. But if it's just a component, chemical that is fixing on plastic, then it will get consideration from regular monitoring of contaminants more. And then what is important to understand is that the different compartments, the meaning of the liter in the different compartment means different things, is different. And then the best practices document must precise and give precisions on the interpretation that is possible from. And so, for instance, it must be clear that, I mean, litter from beach is not just only marine, for instance, and on microplastic in sediments, we know that they are different from the floating microplastics. So, I mean, the composition must be known before, and then it must facilitate the interpretation, but it must go also in the best practice document so that we know exactly what kind of information we get from. Then we have also different approaches. We may survey either, I mean, as Alex was explaining, either in details or less detail, but with more information, for instance. But we may also make it very simple. I mean, we could also just locate accumulation areas. And that could be interesting for floating, for instance, not going in details because it's complicated to interpret the presence of litter at a certain time when hours after or the following day, it's somewhere else. So then by iteration, if we have, for instance, cruise by cruises, regular, with opportunistic approach, if each time there is an accumulation areas that is recorded, then with the time, by the iterative process, we will know where exactly all the accumulation areas are. It could be very simple. Each time there is a sailor that will see one accumulation, just record it and send to a database with a map, something like that. And then with the time, so you could have it very simple and gathering a lot of data from everywhere. And at the end, having something more consistent that, I mean, establishing a regular monitoring with counting different categories and so on, in some cases, not really relevant, except you want to follow specific types of items or measures, for instance. Then you may have also regular monitoring that is global to address, I mean, the global issue. I mean, for instance, how plastic is going and where and in what extent. Or you may have also just local monitoring that will not be global, like cigarette butts, for instance. It's of interest for some areas only where there is a lot of, I mean, in the Mediterranean, we have 40% of the litter on certain beaches that are made of, cigarette butts, for instance. In that case, we must monitor there when it's not relevant for global. So in Antarctic, for instance, it's more, you know, the plastic items of fishing, types of fishing gear that are stranding. that is more important to understand, you know, how they are transported at sea, more than some typical. And so we have also to define maybe a specific list of categories that would be more global than just for regular local monitoring.
Yeah, this is another aspect that is important, as François mentioned. But there is another aspect that I would like to incorporate, which I was discussing with Peter Florence here, about what means how can we access the risks to human health? So human health regarding the quality of food, the quality of seafood. Okay, so most countries, especially those that use where people eat a lot of seafood, perhaps may be interested in the quality of the seafood. And then we need to think on macroplastics or microplastics. Of course, we are directing to microplastics. But where? In the guts? Because if we talk about fish, we don't eat fish guts. We clean the fish before eating. So we are talking about the meat itself. That's why mussels are really interesting, because we eat mussels as a whole. The whole mussel is edible. So that in terms of human health, perhaps mussels are more informative than fish, because otherwise we need to analyze microplastics that were assimilated in the tissues. When we use mussels, we get both microplastics in the gut because we eat the gut, and microplastics in the tissues because we eat the tissues too. So it's a kind of biological detail that makes all the difference when we consider human health as a policy concern.
I think we have a hand raised by Stephanie.
Hello, everybody. Well, thinking about the discussions we've been having that perhaps kind of standardize the plastics and kind of talking about more mass and quantity instead of quantity. But earlier, one of the presentators said that the size, the shape, the color also affects the marine life, and then it will affect us as humans. And how can we marry those 2 points of view, kind of having a very easy indicator that policymakers can relate to and can apply with something that truly represents the effect that plastics are having on the whole ecosystem and to us? Thank you very much.
Stephanie, perhaps the GESEMP report 103, the last one on risk assessment, brings some additional insights on that, working on not on the particles itself, but on the community of particles, considering all these aspects together in a risk assessment, in a combined risk assessment. This is a kind of approach that's being developed, but the core, the basic aspects of this they are in the GESEMP report, which is available. Perhaps you can find some more insights there.
Well, I would like to add that, in fact, we have 2 options. The first one is to have more information during regular monitoring. I mean, just adding different types of categories, shapes, colors, and so on in the survey forms. So that would be more time, but we have more detailed information. That's one option. And then the second one is probably having some research project dedicated to this kind of issue. For instance, I mean, how a sea turtle is recognizing the different types of plastics depending on their color and so on. I mean, without colors, white, black, and so on. There are already some papers on that. Trying to understand and to check whether, and also, I mean, regular monitoring on ingested litter by sea turtles could be easy to record, I mean, the colors and so on, even the shapes. And so I think that this is another option. In some cases, we have to understand before we add, I mean, some properties of the attributes to the indicators to be measured in addition to. Understanding that the problem could be to have large-scale monitoring. My feeling is that large-scale monitoring will be a huge amount of support in terms of staff, funding, and so on. And the total cost at the end could be very, I mean, important. And that's the reason we have to start from the beginning. We have to try to optimize it very, I mean, importantly, I would say.
Thank you.
So there's some questions in the chat that maybe we could go back to. First is from Thomas Mayes. Thomas, maybe would you like to speak up and
I was just responding to the first everybody by the way, and some estimates from Chris Aronel. I was just responding from France, so where you were asking the current indicators, what we think about it. So I think the one was each key for my
sorry, Thomas, we have some, at least I have issues with hearing you correctly.
Is it better or shall I type it?
So I don't know about the others, but I can hear you breaking up.
Okay.
Maybe I can just read. Is it the? I will just read the question in the chat. So surely the two main indicators of presence and distribution of marine litter are beach litter, number 1, and microplastics, number 2. Both should be measured in number and mass. The ingested plastic is actually also a distribution indicator and should be measured to guide the real harm indicators, which still need to be defined in the lab or experimental. Finally, the seafloor litter 4 indicator is useful, but rather secondary, as we can follow trends via well-chosen beaches. And then it continues the comment, you could group the monitoring and compliance monitoring, trends and distribution, aimed at following progress of measures and with a certain threshold, which when triggered leads to investigative monitoring, in-depth questions such as impact to specific species. As such, it's a tiered approach and structured towards the needs. And would anybody like to respond to the comments,
yeah.
Thomas?
Yes, about the importance of seafloor. I think that it's not the day today to decide on that, but my feeling is that, I mean, seafloor litter is more than 95% of litter. So understand, this was a mistake at the beginning for SDG 14 to consider just only floating litter. And that's the reason it has been changed since. And so in fact, seafloor is quite important in terms of amounts and in terms of trans inputs and so on, but also in terms of harm. There is a lot, I mean, fishing nets are entangling animals, and this is the most harmful litter in the ocean. And it's a seafloor litter, for instance. And we have many other examples, like, I mean, the settling of different organisms in remote areas and so on, that are not fully understood. And I think that it must be considered somewhere. I mean, it's not as easy because it's deep sea, and we need important means to do that. But it's really important to do. This is the only part of the ocean that has not been, addressed completely. I would say it's not. I mean, we do have a lot to find on surface for sure, still to find. But I mean, you see the subsurface, for instance, the paper that was published recently by the English team on subsurface microplastics. I mean, this is the same question for seafloor litter. Remote areas very deep, and we may find large accumulation areas, such as we did in canyons in the Mediterranean. And so there is a lot to find, but I'm sure that, I mean, it's quite very important. Yeah. Then about the way to monitor and compliance, I mean, I think it's just a question of strategy. I mean, the technical group that will have to decide is something like it will have to find the best strategy and the best way to monitor. opportunistic in some cases and so on. What is important, I think, is to really reduce the number of indicators. It's quite important. You cannot go for all at the same time everywhere. And step by step is more important. You may add some in a few years, for instance, without problem. There will be some new methods. So you may consider changes and something like recycling the process every 6 years, every 10 years, Also, it's quite important to know, we didn't discuss that so far, but that when you analyze within the World Ocean Assessment for the United Nations, I was in charge of preparing the chapter 12. We were about 15, 20 authors with that. And we compiled all information. And it's clear that, I mean, inputs are increasing. We know that there are some places, especially remote areas, where the amount of litter is increasing, especially really remote, I mean, Arctic Ocean, remote islands, and so on. But in many cases, I mean, the trends are so that there is no increasing amount of litter. So it's really more complex than. So it means that monitoring is not necessary every 2 months or 2 years. It could be, I mean, an assessment every 10 years, something like that, really long term, and to just to understand the change. But I mean, monitoring means when the change can be measured. There was a very nice study performed by CFAS a few years ago in UK, and they did test the robustness of sampling by trawling, for instance. And they found that if you want to show, I mean, difference, 20% of difference, you don't need so much effort in terms of sampling. But if you want to show 5% change, then you need far more, I mean, means to be involved and funding to address this, you know. And so it's also important to know exactly what we want to do and to what extent we want to see the changes.
Yes, and may I, as Amy in the sequence was mentioning the need to consider the terminology, she is saying that hotspots may be differently, may mean different things in different countries if it's not globally harmonized. Yeah. So that one country may wish to identify hotspots, and then hotspot means the place with the larger amount of debris. But this larger amount of debris may be not comparable to other sites which have more. And then it's useful in the local scale, but it's not comparable in the global scale. This is really important. But there is another point that I would like to mention to you. That is, the mic is open, folks. Is that sometimes we may be pushed to identify hotspots and monitor hotspots to understand what's happening there based on a given policy. However, this is not a random approach, and then we may be limited to talk about only that hotspots that we are monitoring over time, which is not a representative sampling of a given country or state or municipality. So there are some indications or some suggestions that for global monitoring, it would be important to have randomized beach. And perhaps randomizing beach will not include the hotspots identified in a previous survey. So these are two important things to consider in the design of a monitoring and assessment scheme. Are we going for a randomized approach, or are we going to select the hotspots to identify the trends and see if the policies are working, or we will have a mix of both? This is another important thing to consider.
I see a comment from Thomas and 2 comments, and from Ami about interest of seafloor monitoring at a cost. And I would like to answer this comment, just reading it before. We should also remember the costs involved. Many nations don't have access to the expensive equipment and so on. And we need, I mean, to detect 50% change, we need, I mean, 40 years of that and so on. I understand this point, but I mean, I was explaining that, I mean, the best way would be to use opportunistic approach. So, for instance, JAMSTEC did a lot of dives, and some institution that have not the money, but the means, I would say, the skills, have regular dives everywhere in the world. So it's thousands of dives, and it's quite easy to just analyze the videos and to check where the litter is. And these dives are not only limited to the countries they are covering the oceans everywhere. So South Pacific, South Indian Ocean, and so on. And besides, on a regular basis, you have also the monitoring of, for shallow waters, of marine protected areas that are worldwide, even, not a country without means, I would say. And they are able to, add plastic litter in addition to the different benthic species they are regularly monitoring. So it means that at low cost, you may have a good information on both shallow and deep sea floor. It will not be, to detail the change in the different specific areas because they are not covered regularly, except for shallow waters, but this is to see how the amounts are changing with the time, even if it's long time, because it's really at low cost that we can monitor this kind of approach. It's not, that was the reason why I was explaining it's not really interesting to implement trawling everywhere because it's very expensive in some cases when there is no fishing. And the data are limited to, soft bottoms and so on, when ROVs or diving is covering both rocky and also soft bottoms. So you see the interest. We understand the strategy that must consider the cost and so on. But typically seafloor, if you don't have any information on seafloor, it could be very frustrating for the scientific community. Not to cover the part of the ocean where, 95 to 99% of the litter is. It's a nonsense. And you understand that just monitoring beach litter, for instance, is not monitoring the quality of the ocean. It's also monitoring, the aesthetic impact. There is more impact in terms of management, reduction measures. The people are more interested, but it's not really the marine environment only. At least it's not only the marine environment. And so it's also interpretation could be more complex also.
Yes, the opportunistic approach is really interesting. And as I mentioned here in the chat, we have the reef check protocol. The reef check is a worldwide used protocol for monitoring reefs, both coral reefs and rocky reefs. And it's already including marine litter as a variable. So it's really
a good option, yes.
Yes, really, really important. And there is a comment here from Gilbert Atuka on weights, which is sometimes difficult to wash and remove organisms or remove sediments or remove other things to properly weight the items. And he is talking about some kinds of proxies. Last week, I was discussing aspects on biodiversity here in a program that has now 20 years, the Biota program here. And there was a discussion on what kind of variable would be a good proxy for global biodiversity, marine biodiversity. And there were two. One is temperature, or the most important one is temperature. So you can predict biodiversity globally using temperature in the global scale. In the local scale, it's not a good proxy. So if we may have, perhaps we may have different levels of detail in terms of regarding the things we are going to measure in nature, in fields, to talk about local processes or global processes. Perhaps this could be discussed a little bit more, because perhaps in the global aspect, we don't need too much detail. And perhaps we may use easy things like photographs from tourists in a citizen science approach to have robust data to talk about global patterns in terms of beaches, for example. So this is the Occam's razor we are trying to use here to balance cost and benefits and limits, considering the poor countries and the limitations. Just to add some seasoning in the discussion.
But we have to take care of some tools. I mean, I understand the interest of citizen sciences, but I mean, the app that was developed by NOAA, Marine Tracker, some years ago, we had a presentation from Jenna Jembek, who is the author of that app, the author, yeah. And she was explaining that, I mean, the way the people are behaving is very strange, in fact. So you have some people, they are going every day on the same beach, and they are clicking every day on the same litter, for instance. And then you have also some people, they are not going in winter when it's stormy weather on a beach, while it could be interesting to have, I mean, the data. And they are just only going in summer, you know, it's always, I mean, nice beaches and so on. So, I mean, it's not really at random in terms of information. And from that, they evaluated that it was something like 8 to 10% of the information that was wrong. And so you have to know exactly what will be the relevance of this kind of approach, just taking pictures and so on. When I understand it could be of interest, especially in some remote areas. Okay, no more questions?
No, there are some comments here in the chat.
I'm sorry.
Thomas mentioned it's same with microplastics. Most balances don't go that low, so you end up pulling them again or use a proxy to convert mass from numbers, which is also mentioned, the point is also captured by Carla in relation to numbers and mass. She's saying that the Gilbert is that this is an important view. Even just taking samples from the beach to the lab can cause fragmentation, especially very weathered samples, and cause errors in quantification. So it's not a trivial thing; it's an important aspect, including the weathering of the particles. And then we have comment from Sanai. Yes, we must consider the spatial and the temporal scales that the variables or indicators can address to design or coordinate monitoring programs. Any reaction?
I'm fine with the comment from Sanai. I mean, the best practices document will exactly explain what are the limits, and it means the scale of the assessment and the temporal scale too, for sure.
So I think Stephanie had her hand up for quite a while, unless that's from an old question, but let's check.
It is from my old question. I do not know how to raise my hand. I'm sorry about that.
No worries. I'll do that.
I already did it for you.
Oh, thanks.
Yes, Thomas is bringing this aspect of the power analysis, of power of the sampling, or the analysis, considering the sampling, considering the inherent variability of the system. If I'm right, if I'm wrong, Thomas, please correct me. Some systems, given the variability of and the patchiness of plastic distribution in the surface, in beaches, microplastics in beaches, we have inherent variability that when you use small sample size, the error you have is too so big that prevents you to capture small variations in terms of long-term monitoring if you are comparing means, the average values. So it's really complicated when you go to this approach. And then perhaps you need to use different approaches which are based on regression analysis, not only on ANOVA's analysis of variance. And this could capture temporal variations better than analysis of variance or analysis of temporal series, other types of analysis other than comparisons of averages of means. So this is a really important aspect to mention. Perhaps we need to have an additional information of related to the samples, which is the minimum detectable difference that the sampling efforts allows us to get. So it's not a complicated thing to calculate, and perhaps this will be really, really informative.
Yeah, you are right, Alex. Just one point. I mean, all studies will just say that, I mean, there is no monitoring actually that is relevant.
Say again, François, please.
I think, I mean, if you do a power analysis for all of the studies already ongoing, regular monitoring and so on, I mean, none of the study will show that the monitoring is relevant. They will all show that, I mean, we have to improve it to get the right information. This is a background problem, I would say. We don't have the means to monitor properly monitor in the environment. So we need, I mean, far more, as it was stated by Thomas in the chat, I mean, we need really a lot more of sampling, analysis, and so on to get relevant results in terms of temporal and scale assessment. Unless you want to see, I mean, very broad changes and so on, but I mean, that will not happen anyway. And the problem is that the policymakers are waiting for 5% change in 2 or 3 years only, you know, and nobody is able to show that actually.
Yeah, globally not, but in the local
Yes.
scale, it's really possible.
Yes, the only cases will be if you ban smoking on the beach, for instance, then you the difference in 2 or 3 years. For sure. But I mean, for global monitoring or large-scale monitoring, I would say it's so complicated too, just because of the poor sampling.
Yes, Thomas is mentioning here that for beaches in Europe, probably a few extra 1,000 beaches would be needed. For seafloor, around 10,000 extra stations, and for microplastics, over 100,000 samples per region.
When we started for seafloor monitoring in 2011-12, CIFAS did, and in fact, I mean, the sampling is relevant, but to show 20% changes, and it will take a long time for that. But if you want to detect 5%, I think we need, I mean, probably hundreds of sampling stations more actually. So it depends, you know, the refinement of what you want.
Yeah, he's saying here that Europe is not a place where wastes entering the ocean is most important. No, so
Mediterranean is the most Mediterranean is the most affected area, and part of it is European.
No? The other comment is, or the other option is time. In 100 years, can we also do it? No?
I mean, I think it's an important point to discuss. I mean, we may decide, or the people in charge of global monitoring may decide that, I mean, assessment will be done every 10 or 20 years only because of the technical means and because of the lack of data, and because, so why not? I mean, this is an option and it must be at least discussed. I understand it's not really relevant for policymakers that would like to see the results of their reduction measures very quickly. But I mean, if it's the only way to have relevant conclusions, then why not? But it must be discussed. And I see that Thais Fonseca told, do we have time? Maybe. I don't know.
I mean, you know, for climate observations, this is exactly what the assessments rely on, right? Decadal hydrographic surveys, and it's absolutely sufficient. And this hasn't been changed for 30 years, I think, because it's completely adequate. Maybe not for biology and ecosystem changes, but trends in that require anyway 20 years or plus 20 or 30 years plus of time series. But I think that's a valid point that maybe these assessments don't need to be carried out very often.
Yes, but we may have also other options, such as, for instance, if you check the trend for each of the beach that you will monitor properly, because you're covering the whole beach, and then you classify an area with some criteria, such as if there is one beach that is not decreasing, the area is not decreasing, and that's maybe sufficient to see that it's not going the right way. You see, so it depends on the interpretation you choose in terms of measurement that will be correct. And that's statistically for the scale assessment, it could be a problem. For trend assessment, it could be a problem. But if you choose a criteria where just one sample is not decreasing to characterize the whole area as not good, then it could be okay. Or you say 50% of the sites are decreasing instead of one only, and or if it's decreasing in more than 50%, then it's good. It will be the expert judgment more than a statistical analysis, and it makes sense also. But I mean, it depends what you want to see. But I understand that time scale is quite important, especially for marine litter and especially for seafloor litter, because they are not degrading so fast. Huh?
Yeah, but there are two aspects that perhaps can shed light into this discussion. One is related to climate monitoring. We have buoys, we have meteorological stations and oceanographic stations, and they are points normally. Huh? And based on the points, you extrapolate. Huh? Perhaps we may have some points, some beaches, or some locations in the bottom, or some organisms or places where we measure all things together, and then these points, tens or hundreds of points worldwide, perhaps they may give us the information to think globally. This is one aspect. Even with this variability in the data. This is one aspect. The other aspect is that variability of the data depends on the behavior of the systems. For example, sand beaches. Sand beaches are complicated to study because they are so dynamic. They are so dynamic that normally we don't know what we are measuring in the sand beach. For example, if we are measuring accumulation and standing stock or the input rates. So that if we prepare the beach to receive the litter, and that's what Peter Ryan is doing in South Africa. You clean the beach and collect the beach not after 6 months. You collect in a period that you are able to capture what's coming into the beach, so that you may use 7 days, 1 week, or 2 weeks, or 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and then you may have a specific type of information that may be less erratic, variable than the traditional sampling we do on sand beaches. This is a possibility to tackle this high variability. There are 2 comments here. Thomas says the new science study from Stephanie Borelli, which is here. shows that we don't have time and that the current measures are not enough to stop the plastic tide. So time is not option here. And Gilbert Atuga said, I read a paper on use of artificial intelligence, neural networks in prediction of litter abundance, and that such efforts can reduce costs for future monitoring. Anyone to shed light on this? Perhaps UNEP guys. I don't have any light to shed.
I have personally a comment on the work from that was published on Trends. I mean, this is a typically good work, but on based in modeling. And the point is that, you know, when you look at real data, I mean, the problem we have, we did compile that for the World Ocean Assessment for the United. It will be published at the end of this year. And we compiled all the data. And the problem is that in many studies, probably more than 80% of the studies on something like 35, 40, so it means 25 or 30 studies, the trend shows that there is no change. And this is the case on seafloor, on microplastics, ingested by sea turtles and so on. So it's probably more complex than just an increase everywhere. We do have transportation for remote areas, probably. We are sure that some areas they are increasing, it's increasing, but we have a lot, we understand, I mean, about sampling is not always correct and so on, but it's, at least it has been published. And so it's more complex than just litter is increasing everywhere. And so I would like to see with the time, what will be the balance between models and data real. For instance, I've been discussing with some Chinese scientists about the modeled data of inputs of microplastics through the Yangtze River, for instance. That was defined as the most important in the world in terms of inputs. But in fact, what they are counting is far less, you know. And so there is something that I mean, we must take care of that, you know. And so that was my comment. When I understand that it could be said that, I mean, it's too late and we have more coming.
Yes. There is another comment here from Carla. She's saying, so we need to prioritize areas and applications of monitoring programs on a global scale. What's representative, what needs to be assessed globally, and still promote the development in greater detail for local scales, harmonize it, and that can inform local, regional policy and combat actions. It's a kind of tied approach, thinking globally, but also locally with different intentions or applications.
Yeah, it makes sense. But the problem is that, will that be representative from the global ocean or just dedicated to some specific issue in some places only? So this depends on what you want to know. If you want to know about how the change are in the ocean, or if you want to know on a specific place or where there is the most litter is.
François, about the oceans, what do you think about the conversion zones? It's not easy, but we can think about some process. We dedicated sampling program around the conversion zone, the subtropical regions, no?
Yeah. So, I mean, there is a real question, but it's because of the currents. So it's well understood. There is a good reason, I mean, physical reasons that makes litter accumulating there. But what is important is that in terms of total amounts, I mean, the work from Marcus, Eric Van Zeeby, and so on, the total amount will just be, I mean, for floating 300,000, and in the giant, I mean, in the Atlantic, it was evaluated at 1,000 tons only of microplastic. By now, it's very important. So there is a specific pattern because of current circulation. It's quite interesting scientifically, but environmentally, I'm not sure that, because it's far less than in coastal areas like in the Mediterranean or the Gulf of Bengal. And so it's far less important. So it depends on what you want. If you want to understand how it works, I mean, why they are converging and so on, this is the place to work on, for sure. But if you want to clean the ocean and if you want to prevent from pollution, it's not the place to work. It will be more probably in bays, rivers, and so on that are more coastal. You see the difference between science and environment.
Yeah, I completely agree with the idea that to clean is a different problem. I was thinking about monitoring, because we know we have some idea about the physics in these typical regions, so we can put some efforts on the observations, and so we can validate the model at least in such regions, and we can expect that the global models will behave correctly in many regions.
Yes, but you understand, I mean, your work will be to understand better. Then if you want to monitor, if you go in the middle of the Atlantic by opportunistic means, a boat that is coming there, then you can sample to confirm, validate your model and so on, and use that for monitoring, why not? But in terms of environment, what the policymakers are looking for, and then they will ask more for what is entering through the rivers. That could be also one of the indicators, what is coming from the rivers, you see? And so it will be a balance of them. So assessing the global state of the ocean is not only the convergence zones. Environmentally, there will be some more, I mean, important zone by the coast, I think. And but then scientifically, this is a typical, I mean, this is a specific scheme that needs probably more attention. Yes. Then you see the issue that comes with the modeling is that it looks, for me, I'm not a modeler, so it's quite easy to say that, but it looks like modeling the convergence in the central part of the oceans is probably more easy than modeling the accumulation in coastal waters because of turbulence. It's more complex probably, and it's more coastal. It's more interesting probably in coastal waters. So if the effort from modelers goes to the coastal areas, maybe it will be very more interesting, no?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the open oceans, it's at least some, we'll say not easy part, but at least a better understood part that we can achieve with a monitoring system adequately sampled for these typical regions. Yeah. But after, of course, the complexity and the challenge will be on the coastal areas, where we have to combine.
And also,
it's not only a nature of turbulence, it's just a context of so many processes will be implied and probably are important, could not be discarded if you want to monitor the interaction with the littoral and the beaches and so on.
And also, even from the harm point of view, the point is that, I mean, the amount of chemicals that are fixed in plastic, for instance, is a steady state, depending on the presence in the water and with a higher affinity to hydrophobic surface like plastics. And but as far as the plastic is going offshore, then it will release some of the plastics, and the total amount of plastics far in the convergence zones will be less. So in terms of harm by chemicals, that will be less than coastal waters again, you know. And so it depends what you are looking for. Then again.
Yeah, of course.
So there is a comment from Amy here saying that I agree with that, with what Francois said regarding what to monitor. It always comes back to clearly defining the question and the purpose of monitoring. So it's an iteration. We need always to see if we are in the correct track, in the correct way, logically and methodologically, in all aspects.
But you cannot prevent from monitoring because of the lack of information. We had to face that situation in Europe when we started 10 years ago. I mean, the question were always why to monitor the amount of microplastic in birds, and what will we do with that data? I mean, trawling is just on soft bottom and so on. And if we do not, but without starting, you don't have any question coming more. And at the end, I mean, we have a well-structured network actually, with a lot of information that will be improved, and we know exactly where the questions are, and probably we'll have some new indicators coming, but it's just because we started without all information. So it's quite important. It was said by Sandra in the previous session that it's time to go, and I think that we must start on some indicators, at least for sure. So I mean, we have some background information to know exactly what are the limits, and we will always find a limit for any of the indicators anyway. But I mean, I think it's quite important to let's start the process, you know, and
So just maybe go back to this question of having the right set of questions to have a fit for purpose monitoring. I mean, I understand that on a national or regional level, you might not have a consensus about what these key questions are, but on a global level, there is consensus, or is there no? Right? So if you really wanted to pick the list of indicators that would answer these questions, you would know which documents or which organization to turn to, and that would not be a stumbling block as it might be for I don't know, a national like we heard from Norway or from Brazil.
I like the idea of AD that was presented recently at the G20 meeting. Probably it will come later, the notion of excellence center. So, I mean, some dedicated structures or groups or institutions and so on in charge of one type of one database with managing all the data and so on, participating in probably in technical group and so on to exchange on that. But excellence center, it means, I mean, managing all the questions around one indicator, for instance, and with different excellence center, you may cover. I mean, you say, for instance, that IOC and August may not go for beach litter. For instance, typically this is a UNEP thing, you know, regional sea conventions could be managed by an excellence center somewhere on beaches, for instance, when oceanographic data, you know, surface microplastics and so on, could be managed by IOC more easily and so on. You know? At the end, probably the group and not only the coordination group, but the scientific group will be something like a GIEC for the climate, you know, this is my feeling. We see the change. I mean, the paper that were published recently, the one from Lowe and the one from Boel in Science, both were on modeling trends and how the change are in the future, you know, and increasing and nature and measures and so on. I mean, this is something like reminiscent from what it was in for climate change years ago. And there are some groups that have been created to support and to analyze the trends and so on. And probably this is what we need at the global scale, you know, to understand how it changes with the time and so on. So it's clear that, I mean, we do have a lot of limits for each of the indicators, but I mean, there is no other way to do that, and that will be the way. That then what could be, I mean, the different type of excellence center, I would say, or coordination group for merge somewhere in a group to assess that and to provide for the required.
We lost you, Francois.
Really?
Yeah, the last words we missed.
I know. I was just saying this was my feeling.
So, Francois, what you described then, this final assessment would be a combination of scientific and environmental, right?
I mean, you need both, yeah. Science is the best practice. Environmental is the decision making. You know?
I think Sanai raised her hands.
Yeah, yeah. I was just curious about the recommendations on France's slide, and it says like a possible shortlisting of the most relevant indicators relevant for the global scale monitoring, and there's a 4 indicators: beach litter, seafloor litter, microplastic, and ingested litter. And these 4 indicator, possible shortlisted indicator, is not identical, but almost the same as the indicators listed in Marine Litter white paper. So I just wonder, so is it this 4 indicator is recommended by the UNEP, so in a white paper. So I just wondered, so this means this 4 shortlisted of your recommendation is already endorsed. The GESAM recommendation was already endorsed by the UNEPs.
Yes, I mean, generally speaking, yes. What has been
I
mean by shortlisting is to select the right indicator in. For instance, for seafloor, I did explain that trawling is not relevant because it cannot be upscaled. It's impossible. So we have to find for seafloor the right indicator. And I mean, there are some limits in using this type or this type. And at the end, we need just one will be relevant. That was my idea. So shortlisting means selecting from the different compartments to be monitored, such as beach, as you said, and endorsed by UNEP, beach, floating, and or seafloor, impact, and so on. Select the most relevant, actually, to be discussed more in depth before we start directly on that, you know. And so it needs, besides, we will need some best practice document to know exactly what are the limits of each indicator, including power analysis and this kind of things. And at the end, we know exactly how to implement that. But what is important to understand is it's not beach monitoring, but it's visual observation of beach. You see, it's not harm, but these were just examples, must be discarded. The recommendation would be more to shortlist the indicators than listing all the one presented on the slide. It must be improved, discussed more, and so on for weeks, months, and so on. You know, but I mean, it was just to give an example. The idea is to shortlist the number of indicators from the list that are given from by UNEP in the white paper and from different initiatives and so on, to make sure that they may fit with the constraints for global monitoring. That's the only point.
Thank you.
It looks like in a church, huh?
So, Francois, maybe you could bring up the screen again with your slide with the recommendations. Or?
Okay. You have it?
Yep.
So this one is the recommendation, possible shortlisting of the most relevant indicators. And these are examples from the analysis I made, but I mean, it must be refined for sure. I'm sure that some of the indicators will not fit. We may add some other, like the one on the database on the species that are rafted by litter, for instance. It's another possibility, you see. And microplastic, I think that sediments also will be relevant with the time, and protocols are more and more efficient. Then the problem will be to define the right size of plastics we do assess. If we go to 50 micrometers, 100 micrometers, it will not be relevant for monitoring because we do have too many problems still to solve. I mean, contamination and so on, characterization. When for larger pieces, I think it will be okay. You see, so this kind of constraints will come during the discussion to come, future discussions. But even if the general scheme has been endorsed by UN, we must select from the list of indicators those that are the most relevant. For instance, beach litter assessed by drone has important potential, but it's not sufficiently advanced to be used at the moment.
So I was wondering if we could just for a minute go back to the point from Christophe Maillet, because if the global modeling is providing information for the top global SDG indicator, then for example, what is Christophe's perspective on what this shortlisting should include to better evaluate his models? Is that the floating microplastics, or because
I mean, before Christophe answer, I mean, I'm fine with having floating plastic, floating litter in general, large included, if it fits well with, I mean, Goose approach, for instance, opportunistic approach. But the problem is that, I mean, from our experience within the MSFD, even microplastics, for instance, the results are just interesting at the scale of a region because they are moving every day. I mean, permanently. So when you see the same problem that contaminated seawater, I mean, it's not often used in terms of monitoring because the water is moving. So when you assess a place for microplastics, the day after the microplastics are not in the same place. You understand that? So the reporting will be at larger scale than just the sample size. You see?
Christophe had to leave. Sorry. What I understood, to reply to Arthur from my discussions with Christophe, and it's not exactly my field, but the global model, the one he uses, the one he develops, when they are augmented by the measurements that are made in local, in situ, near the beaches in different places of the world, plus the influx from several main rivers, then they can change the global repartition or the global accumulation. Here, the accumulation are in the same place, but especially in Indian Ocean and South Pacific, it's the way this accumulation, the plastic go out on one side or the other. So are they going to go in the west of the ocean, Indian Ocean, or in the east that is in the Pacific? Things like that, where the global modeling is very important to refine the understanding when adding information which are real, in the sense that they are observed directly at the level of at the local scale. That's what I understood, and that's what we were talking together in terms of a synergy between the modeling, which is what it is, and the monitoring or the observations, let's say, in order to do the refinement once the model started and develop these accumulations patches. Maybe we try to write something or to present something on Wednesday about that. We still have one day to prepare the PowerPoint.
But one important point, I think, is that we cannot avoid data in terms of monitoring.
Yes, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's shifting a bit. Let's say from the physics, etc., going to the data processing, data science. I've been presenting different, especially in a plenary session as well, the way that you can go from the model to the data, or from the data per se to the models, and build a model based on observation, data and observation, let's say, about the same, and measurements. And then I saw one question in a list about the artificial intelligence and so on. So that's where the artificial intelligence could be above. I mean, the person was mentioning the neural network, which is the data processing, but the artificial intelligence is going to, as I understood, and what we do in my institution, pick where these sources of information are and could be, and then improving the global model from all the available data. That's monitoring is one, in situ, satellite, observation, citizen science, others, local models as well, which is also an input and so on. So I think we are talking about the same thing mainly. That's we need to have more data. We have too many, but we need more.
Richard?
Great, thank you. The old technique of indicating I'd like to make a point. I was just wondering whether it was very wise to refer to floating as a relevant indicator. I mean, we know that the material that's floating is much less than 1% that exists in the environment, and it strikes me that although this is very easy, or not very easy, although this is an easier environment to sample, unless we've got a good understanding between the material that's floating and the material that's in the sediment underneath and in the water column, it's not perhaps very useful to talk about having this as a focus, looking at the floating stuff. It strikes me that that's sort of, we know it's not the most important part of the story, although it may well be a close relationship between floating and that which is sunk. Just strikes me that that's not perhaps the best thing to put into a higher level objective.
Good question, Richard, and I agree with that. The story is that, I mean, the only indicator that was retained when we started, I mean, for Ocean Decade, it was a meeting in the United States, and just floating leader was retained at the beginning. And so it has been changed now. I mean, other compartments will be addressed. And but it's true that, I mean, it's just a few percent, I mean, even less than 1% of the marine litter. And in terms of environment, it's not so important. But in terms of science, maybe it's more. And in terms of sampling, that's the reason why probably it has been considered more. And also because I think the idea behind the global monitoring is often to have a global, I mean, tool that may give the information very quickly. And so satellite, for instance, or modeling may help for that. And the focus for this, I mean, approaches are more floating, and that's the reason why there is some interest there. But in terms of monitoring, and especially environment, I think that it's probably not the best, but this is I mean, consider that for now.
I mean, it could be that we find there's a close relationship between what's on the surface and what's in the water column and in the sediment, in which case it's fabulous.
There is some work on that, actually.
Yep.
Yeah, but the problem is that it has not been quantified. They are trying to link the different categories of the litter that are floating with those on beaches and so on. But I mean, it's just a starting interest, I would say.
So it's a different concept than the WYSIWYG. What you see is maybe connected to what you get. We have to find a new acronym. Sorry.
So there was, Francois, you mentioned the idea from Heidi and from UNEP for the Excellence Center as a means of organizing these technical workshops to further harmonize the protocols and approaches around individual indicators. So I was wondering, maybe we can get a quick feedback from people in the room. What do they think about that? Or?
I think 80 is there, no?
I've got too many different windows open to check, but maybe René could do that.
She's in, but she has to unmute the mic.
Well, in the meantime, I'll just mention that there's a discussion in the chat between Inga and Amy about the fact that there is base and scale monitoring of floating microplastics, but that there's still differences in methods, and the results from the different basins are not comparable. And that's something.
But I mean, except before we come to that point about the discussion, the idea was raised, was presented at the last G20 meeting that was held earlier this month, and AD, I mean, said that there was an interest to have some excellence center, and as a counterpart, the organizer, I mean, Japan of the meeting, they did ask for more harmonization. That was one of the conclusions of the meeting, that in many cases we need to harmonize, especially because the different database and indicators are often measured the same way, but not reported the same way. So this is exactly the topic of the discussion between Ami and Inga.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think everyone's hitting on the same point, that we're not using, everyone is putting effort towards understanding what is happening, especially if we take microplastics, for instance, but the methods and reporting maybe are not transparent enough or comparable enough. There are some methods, when you look at them in real finite detail, that a tiny change in one person's or one team's protocol will then render the comparison between their data and another set of data irrelevant. So I think there's so many steps again within the puzzle to try and understand, or to how to make data more comparable. And I think the MantaNet and the surface sampling data is a really good example of the problems. There are problems in all compartments, but there's also been some really good steps forward to try and understand how to reduce the inconsistencies between studies. And I know there's still a lot of work to be done, but it's very encouraging that there are groups that are finally being able to like pull apart the pieces of a puzzle. And I know I've sat across several different working groups, and there's always a discussion that comes up as to, do we sample which compartments and why? And to see working groups that are now trying to actually put reasons behind, and some solid reasons behind, why we should do one thing or we shouldn't do something, and how to minimize the differences is really encouraging to see, because it's helping to inform decisions like the discussions that we're having now. So I just wanted to leave that as like a kind of a discussion point, or like a thinking point, not a discussion point.
Yeah, just one point maybe about the MantaNet role. In fact, for historical reason, this is the tool that is mostly used for microplastic, but there are, some good reason for that. If you want to sample the water volume, for instance, you will use some meter cube, and that will not be representative of an area when Manta is covering thousands of meters square. So that's one point. Then the frame of the Manta is moving at the surface. It's not constant and take note of the water. So it means that the volume that are calculated are not good. And that's the reason why results are reporting by surface units. And then if you go to a smaller sized particles, you may use a Manta at 200 micrometers, for instance. Not only you may have risk of clogging, but also the problem is that you may have interference with contamination, and you must characterize very small particles. So there is a rationale for using Manta. I understand it's not the best. It's just a proxy of microplastic, and this is the reason why it has been spread, because it's in a way relevant. So we understand it may be improved one day, but this kind of argument also must be discussed, but it must be understood that in some case, what has been used for years may be also relevant. Then about the compartment, for many years, the people were thinking that most of the microplastic were at the surface, and in some case, maybe they are. And so it looks like, we may have a lot of subsurface microplastic that we're not considering for now. So we have also to consider these compartments, but for sure.
So I think it's a chance for some final comments as we approach the end of this session.
So yes, my final comment probably for me to be maybe not to go into too many details when recommending for recommendation, but at least, I mean, shortlisting the most relevant indicators is important, giving some examples like pitch and so on. Then the importance of best practices to manage the whole process, but detailed, that means a lot of work to come. And then harmonization through workshops, and probably better fit with the organization UNEP want and IOC wants for global monitoring. I mean, in terms of either excellence center or center for competences and so on, and I don't know, or managing group and this kind of thing. But I mean, it's some recommending something that may fit with all the requests.
So, in my opinion, we have a very good, we had very good insights to improve our exercise in thinking on variables and indicators of marine litter. So, very important aspects that were captured by the participants and shared with us. So, this input was highly valuable.
Yes, and I want to thank especially Francois and Alex for leading the discussions, for the comprehensive introductions. I've enjoyed this session a lot. I certainly learned a lot as a newbie in the marine litter environment, and I hope all the participants enjoyed the discussions we had. So thank you very much to all, and we'll be sharing the recording and the synthesized notes. Probably by tomorrow morning or something in the shared Google folder for all participants.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you all. Really happy to have. Yeah, thank you, Alex, Arthur, and have a nice day, evening, afternoon. And
Good night.
Good night.
Sorry.
Yes.
Probably meet again in during the next session. Then I will be commenting them. Have a good time all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Really good. Really good.